NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member presents the Board Governance Series with series contributors Meridian Compensation Partners, Diligent Board Member Services, and Broadridge Financial Solutions. On this edition, Compensation Committee Trends and Issues with Jamie McGough, Partner, Meridian Compensation Partners.
Hi, I'm Laura Finn, web editor of boardmember.com, and today I have Jamie McGough with me in the boardroom. Jamie is a partner at Meridian Compensation Partners. Jamie, thanks for joining me today.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
We're still operating right now in a highly sensitive environment with regards to executive compensation. When you're working with board members, what do comp committee members want to spend the most time on, and what are they really interested in right now?
Well, there's a bit of an evolving regimen that's happened with compensation committees. Some things that they cover are old, and some things that are new or changing over time. Things like, are we using an optimal comparator group for benchmarking? That's, of course, been a long time subject that they would undertake. More recently, though, close attentiveness to say on pay votes, the voices of their shareholders. They're spending a lot more time on that than they might have, say, a few years ago before say on pay came along. And probably most prominently is our pay and performance issues. And that's been an old subject in many respects, and it's always been the responsibility of the Compensation Committee to be focused on that. And it's never been more true than it is now.
Jamie, I think all companies want to be able to say that their executives' pay is tied to performance. But how do you assess if a company actually has a solid pay for performance pay structure in place?
It's almost a truism now. Everybody wants pay and performance, but there are several key elements that you look for and try to test. One is, do we have a sufficient degree of pay at risk? The other is, are we using the right performance measures? Are we using measures that correlate to shareholder value? And that'll vary by company, by industry, by company circumstances over time. Do we have the right mix of short and long-term incentives? Are we setting sufficiently stretched goals? Companies spend a lot of time on that. And then lastly, to kind of close the loop, is there alignment over time between, say, the percentile ranking of your pay, what people are actually earning, and the percentile ranking of performance? Those two things should be directionally consistent over time. Those elements in combination really constitute what is really kind of an enduring structure for pay and performance.
Out of all the ones you mentioned, goal setting seems to be the one that gives comp committee members the most trouble. How can a compensation committee make sure that the goals they set aren't too lenient and also aren't too difficult to reach?
If you think about most, particularly goal-based incentive programs, there's a threshold, a target, and a maximum. And so you're trying to establish what is acceptable, good, and exemplary performance. And of course, it varies by company, it varies by measure, it varies by circumstances, varies by industry. And it usually ends up being a combination of kind of both analytical rigor and business judgment. You need both. But what we find is that there tends to be 4 or 5 things that in combination, no one perspective tells you the right answer, but usually in combination there's an overlap. So for instance, what's been the recent performance of the company? There's going to be some consistency between where you've been and where you're going. Secondly, what are the long-term aspirations of the company? What's the long-term strategy? We want to get here, we're here, there should be some sensible migration between where we are and where we want to be over the long haul. What's the performance of a relevant group of peers? Basically looking at history. What is acceptable or exemplary performance? Looking at those peers can give guidance to what we should be expecting for ourselves. That's kind of a backward-looking perspective. You can also look at what our shareholders, analysts expecting going forward. That's a forward-looking perspective. And then lastly, what's the degree of sharing for any particular level of goals? If we achieve those goals, what sharing in the profitability or in the value creation would accrue to the participants versus shareholders? And what is the balance between those two? As I said, when you look at all those variables in combination, usually there's an overlap that emerges of what would be a sensible and balanced set of goals.
Not an easy task, certainly.
Not an easy task, but companies, as I said, are spending a lot of time on this. They want to get it right, and it's subject to more and more scrutiny.
Some companies have started voluntarily using the proxy to actually illustrate how their company's executive pay is tied to the company's overall performance. How long do you think it will be until that becomes the norm amongst all companies?
Certainly the proxy, the executive summary, that has been kind of the informal front end of a CD&A, where companies are really trying to tell their story, trying to convey in a summarized fashion is our pay and performance aligned, and in particular, how has the company performed. Now this issue that you're getting to, companies are moving, I think, in a measured way. They want to show performance, but they also know showing compensation, realized compensation, is complicated because you have different time frames involved. You have short-term incentives, you have salary, you have long-term incentives of varying duration. Some are 3 years, some are 10 years as with an option. And you're trying to do it in a way that is reasonably straightforward, fairly simple to understand in a confined space. So what I think we're going to find is that companies will move in a measured way. They'll stick with the performance variables, I think, focusing on how has the company performed over time relative to their goals, relative to their peers, and convey that as a measure of performance, and probably not go too deep into the performance, into the compensation portion, because it's so complicated, and there is not a single convention that says this is how you measure realized pay. And because, again, if one company focuses on options, as a for instance, those are 10-year instruments. Another company focuses on a performance plan, those are 3-year time frames generally. So I think it's going to be a while before we have an established convention before companies say we look at pay and performance exactly this way for purposes of the proxy.
Great. Jamie, thank you so much for joining me today in the boardroom.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching this edition of the Board Governance Series.
Jamie McGough can be reached at jmcgough@meridiancp.com. The Board Governance Series is a presentation of NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member.